issued so far, you know, you sort of have to really get your head around it, and some of it is actually quite contradictory. I'm not saying we've got all the answers. We're doing our best to keep on top of the legislation, but it changes as time goes on. So you've got to bear with us and bear with ACRE, who are trying to interpret all the regulations that are coming out from different departments in the government, and they are trying to keep on top of the information to date. So obviously it's talking about the roadmap to reopening that the Prime Minister announced. I can't remember the date now, but it was a few weeks ago. And it's good timing actually, because yesterday was obviously the anniversary, the first year anniversary of the first lockdown. So it's nice to think that we can talk about unlocking at this stage. It's a year on now. So next slide, Emma, please. Okay. So as Emma has already explained, we plan to go through to 12 o'clock, but we don't mind if it goes on a little bit longer, or if you have to go early, that's absolutely fine. But sometimes if there's lots of questions, we can stay on a little bit longer and answer some of those. So first of all, we're going to look at what are the key challenges for village halls and charities and trustees as we come out of COVID-19, the things that are affecting village halls the most. The 4-step roadmap to unlocking, mainly as it applies to village halls. We're not talking about the whole unlocking rules and regulations, but the things that are pertinent to you that are managing those community buildings. So V and CHS is a shortened way of saying village and community halls. So you might see that through the presentation. We will talk about Appendix D of the ACRE reopening information sheet, because that is the main appendix that's going to be updated. Those of you that are familiar with the ACRE information sheet will be talking about that to remind ourselves about why that came out, obviously for the reopening back in July last year. But it's Appendix D is the main one that's going to be amended and updated. We're going to touch on business support grants because they are time limited. So that again has been quite a complex area for village halls to understand whether they're eligible or not. So you've got the opportunity to ask questions about that. Then maybe talking about opportunities for the future and looking at the impact as we come out of COVID, what's changed, what are the implications for village halls and how they can perhaps capitalise on that a little bit. Now I've put at the bottom there, it said spreadsheet to reopening. That is something that ACRE are trying to compile at the moment, and they're trying to put all of the 4 steps into an easy to use, understandable way to see what can and can't open. So they're going to put it and develop that into a spreadsheet. It's not ready yet, so I'm just going to talk about that. Next slide, Emma, please. So what has changed? The whole of the COVID has changed so many things. So for trustees, there's a lot more legislation and of course public safety concerns with all the public health regulations that have been had to be imposed. And it's hard for volunteers to get their heads around all of these new requirements that they've had to follow. Changing community needs, how the community can access the venue or not. Changing in the demographics of communities, different age groups, and obviously there's older people being affected more, probably in the rural areas, because there's a lot more older people living in the rural areas. And of course, COVID has meant that we've all become, or had to become, more reliant on IT. And how has that been affecting charities and village halls? So it has been, people have had to adapt and change to cope with the new life that we're living. And of course, trustees are concerned about anybody coming into the hall. What is the risk of spreading the infection? They're concerned about who would be liable if things go wrong. So this has obviously been a time of anxiety and concern for those trustees. I mean, we've already, over the last year, navigated 3 lockdowns, coming to terms with social distancing, hand washing, the rule of 6, the introduction of face coverings, test and trace, QR codes, then the tier system, and now we've got to get our heads around the 4-step roadmap to reopening. So it's been a hectic time, a very confusing time. But thankfully, the guidance that we've been using for village halls is the ACRE information sheet, which they developed last year. They are now on the 8th version of that. So when we're talking about navigating how it's changed, they've had to keep updating that information sheet, and it's now on the 8th version. And no doubt that will change probably several times again in the future. So the next slide, please. So what are the key challenges? Pandemic has created great uncertainty. There's been a change in use as part of the COVID-19 response. So obviously halls have been used for maybe test and trace, vaccination centres, maybe used by businesses. So there's been a change in use of what the charity is there for. Trustee burnout has been a major worry, major concern, because people have had to get their heads around or try and understand all the changing government regulations. So there's going to be a time where people will say, well, I've had enough of this. You know, it's volunteers that are running these charities. And it's a major concern, not just for village halls, but I think lots of charities. The idea of trustee burnout means that there may be a lot of people, as we move forward, may decide to step down, and that will be a big challenge to recruit new people to run the charities. Another key challenge, especially moving forward, will be how you go and re-engage back with the community and user groups. You've lost that contact over the last year. How do you then re-engage them and encourage them back to use the village hall? So we've talked about the changing needs of the community. So, you know, it may be that the hall's been used for other things, maybe like a food bank. It may have been used by a local business person to have their hot desk so they can work from the community centre. So that's a major challenge. I think the whole pandemic has actually highlighted that village hall committees have got to have a wide range of skills. So a key challenge there again, have you had enough people that have got those skills, such as digital skills, the marketing skills, which is going to be crucial moving forward, and the ability to do more strategic planning rather than carrying on, this is what we've done, we'll just carry on working the way we have for years and years and years. It may be now that you've got to do a little bit more you know, strategic planning and marketing to target and try and recruit, you know, encourage more people back to use the hall. And we've already talked about the challenge of recruiting new trustees. And in last year's ACRE survey, that was the biggest challenge that was identified from halls across the whole of England. So recruiting new trustees is going to be a continuing difficulty as we move forward. And of course, halls, it may be loss of revenue. That's debatable with the business support grants that have been around, but maybe some halls haven't been able to access those or weren't aware of them. So loss of revenue could be a challenge if you can't get your regular user groups to come back. So the next slide, Emma, please. So that is the image that we've seen 3 times over the last year where halls have been closed. There have, of course, been activities that halls were allowed to open for. So I'm hoping that trustees were aware that there was a list of activities that they could stay open for. And in the 4-step lockdown, where it lists these things that can start to take place as the restrictions are eased, it doesn't list always the ones that they were already allowed to do during lockdown. So when you look at the lists, say from ACRE, and it's talking about the activities that you can do from certain dates, so from March the 8th when schools could open, and they could also use village halls. Obviously during lockdown they were probably being used anyway, so it's not listing them again when you see the 4 steps, because there was already a big list of things that could take place in village halls. So please don't forget that there is a list of things that are still eligible to take place in village halls. That list is available on the website. If you've not actually seen it before, go onto the Rural Action Derbyshire website, and the pages to do with the reopening for village halls, you will find that list on there, and you can download a copy. But I think the difference with this reopening now is the fact that the government are hoping that this is the last time. There's no guarantee, but they're hoping now. Some halls have not opened for a whole year because they may not have had the confidence, not had the ability to put all the precautions in place. But this time now, those that have been closed have got to start planning and thinking about reopening and try and get back to some sort of normal. If they don't, when they're legally allowed to open, but they're not, they're still hesitant, maybe slightly afraid of reopening, they've got to check with their insurance company. They've got to make sure their insurance company know that they're still closed, because there could be some implications with that. But also they may be in breach of trust. So if legally you can be open, but you're not opening, then you're not actually acting in the best interests of the charity. So this slightly, coming out of this 3rd lockdown is almost slightly different, because we're hoping it's the last lockdown, and really no excuse not to start the reopening process. And of course, if you are concerned, RAD always there to give some advice and support if you really feel that you've not got the confidence to reopen. And of course, your beneficiaries, your local community, are going to miss out if you're not opening. Next slide, Emma, please. So basically, the 2 things that you've got to be planning now is to make sure that you are becoming or revisiting your COVID-19 secure venue, the things that you've got to have in place, such as the social distancing and the posters and things like that. As you said, some halls that didn't open or haven't opened, they'll be doing that for the first time. Others that did reopen last summer or have remained open even during the lockdowns, they will have those measures in place. So I'm sure there's a huge variation of what stage halls are at. So that's one thing to be concerned about. And then the other thing that trustees will be concerned about is knowing what activities can take place and when, at which step of the 4-step roadmap they're allowed to do different things as we come out of the lockdown. So the ACRE information sheet I've already mentioned, that has all the information about becoming COVID-19 secure. And again, you can get that on the RAD website. Next slide, please, Emma. Right, so all of the COVID regulations come under the Public Health Regulations Guidance, and it was the Coronavirus Act 2020, which was the primary legislation. And underneath all of that primary legislation, there are lots of other government departments that have issued guidance depending on what area of activity they are responsible for. So, for example, Department of Education, they've come out with guidance for schools and out of schools activities. So, sport and recreation, you know, it's the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Anything to do with employing staff and the furlough scheme and all those sort of grant schemes for employees. That's the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The reopening of multi-purpose community facilities has come under the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. The reason I'm highlighting this is the fact that sometimes the legislation that comes out is slightly contradictory. They don't always marry up exactly the same. So when there is a little bit of confusion or a little bit of doubt, ACRE have tried to interpret the information as best they can, but it has been very complex, and it's been hard to pull and extract the right information from each of these government departments because they're issuing their own guidance. So there may be a slight misinterpretation there. And in the same way, when Boris announced the 4-step lockdown reopening on the 22nd of February, there was further guidance issued on the 25th of February, which was for the multi-purpose community facilities guidance, which contradicted what Boris had said on the 22nd, when he said that halls could open from the 12th of April. And the guidance that came out from on the 25th of February said that halls mainly can open from the 17th of May. So that's why confusion, you know, it confuses all of them, all of us. So next slide, Emma, please. So right, looking at becoming COVID secure, I'm not going to focus on all the things that you have to put in place because it would take a whole day of training to talk about that. But if you're not familiar, if you haven't reopened, basically the information sheet has lots of tools and sample, you know, templates for risk assessments and things like that. And these are all found in the appendices of the information sheet. So as you can see, there are 13 there listed. So you'd have to work your way through those. It's not as hard as it looks, but you know, that's where planning needs to come into place now. So the one that ACRE are currently updating is Appendices D, which is management of social distancing, a risk-based approach, and that's very much to do with what activities can take place and at what step of the unlocking. So that's the crucial one if you're ready to just sort of look at what activities can take place. But if you haven't reopened, you're really going to have to go through all of those to make sure that they are in place and ready so that the public can safely come back into your hall knowing that it is COVID secure. So next slide, Emma, please. ACRE have said, even if you have reopened and obviously closed again for lockdown, that you really do, as a minimum, need to do checklist Appendix A again. So I think they've put that in a recent, the information that they've already issued to village halls a couple of weeks ago. They are saying and advising you to go through checklist A again. So these are the basic things that if you're reopening, you've got to inform your insurance company that you're reopening. Things like check that your key systems and security keys are all in place, ready for letting hires come back in again. That you're using the special conditions of hire, which is actually Appendix E. You know, you don't have to reinvent all of these conditions of hire. So if you're using that, make sure that you're using that when all the hirers come back to the hall. And that is essentially is to make sure that the hirer is making sure that their group of people, their guests, their members, are going to act in a COVID secure way as well. To make sure that the cleaning requirements, the hygiene, if you've got to have extra staff, additional hours or volunteers, make sure all of that is in place so that you can ensure the cleaning requirements can be covered. Have you got your PPE for your staff? The health and safety sort of risk of the Legionella, so flushing through water system sufficiently. The advice is in the information sheet on all of these things. And it's a good advice to go over your routine health and safety risk assessment and your fire safety risk assessments again, just to double check. So if the hall hasn't been used for several months or for a whole year, just to double check that you've not overlooked anything. It's good practice, you know. So make sure, I mean, if there's enough trustees, you should share the workload as well. Don't just rely on one person having to do all of this work. Make sure that you've got the sufficient hand washing facilities and the hand wash, hand gels and things available, and tissues and hand drying facilities. Your signage, managing the social distancing, you've got to have signage up appropriately, floor markings, all of this, which I'm sure you're aware of. If you've not done it before, we can advise you on that, and there's a lot of information how to do that. The designated safe area is if somebody that's actually on site on the village hall premises and they do get COVID symptoms or feeling unwell, it's a place that they can be put to one side, maybe in a separate room or in the corner of the room, so that they're away from the rest of the attendees at the event. So these are the things that you've got to have organised in advance of opening. Next slide, Emma, please. Okay, step 1, which we're already in, obviously, 8th of March has passed. We're virtually at the second part of step 1, because this step is in 2 parts. And the next one starts from next Monday, the 29th of March, so that's looming up. So I think you're aware that all schools will open, have opened, and they can use village halls. Outdoor after-school sports activities and wraparound childcare is allowed. So if parents are at work or they're undertaking training or attending medical care, then it's allowed that the outdoor after-school sports and wraparound care can take place. And at this stage, 2 people will be allowed to meet in an outdoor public space. So they can sit and meet for a coffee, for example, or have a picnic in a recreation ground. And funerals, 30 people, wedding and wakes, which could take place in the village hall, it's only 6 people. So that's the current limit. But as from the 29th, as from Monday, there's a bit of a shift in the social distancing regulations, because it becomes now back to the idea of the rule of six. So if you recall back to last year, they introduced the rule of six. So you're allowed up to 6 people, but not necessarily from the same household. Only outdoors at this stage. So it's the rule of 6 or up to 2 households. So it says rule of 6 or 2 households. Where it says 2 households, they can actually be more than 6 people. So if you've got 2 households of 4 people, or a household with a bubble, plus another household, you can see that the numbers can soon get over the rule of 6. But that is allowed. But again, it's all outside at this stage. I think a lot of people will be happy to hear that the outdoor sport and leisure facilities are going to be open. So things like tennis courts, outdoor bowling or basketball courts, they can all reopen from Monday. Golf courses can open. But it should still be up to 6 people or 2 households at a time using them. So outdoor organised sports for children and adults can take place. I think the stay-at-home rule is being lifted from Monday as well. So it's not illegal to leave the home for things other than work, shopping, and for medical reasons. So I think that's been lifted, the stay-at-home rule. It eases things quite a lot. Minimise travel. I don't think we've got any chance of international holidays for the whole year, I'm thinking, but they're just saying minimise travel there. And up to 15 outdoor parent and child groups. Again, it is outside, not inside the hall at this stage. Okay, next slide. Yes, we touched on this earlier when we were talking about the guidance that was issued on the 25th of February, and this is what caused confusion initially. And it said that indoor events that bring people together, even if they do not mix with other households, cannot run until step 3, which is the 17th of May. This is only permitted if there is an explicit exemption. And this includes support groups, which we'll talk about in a minute, supervised activities for children, parent and child groups, up to 15 people. But children under the age of 5 are not counted in that total of 15. Communal worship or a wedding, a reception or commemorative event like a wake. So the numbers will increase at step 3. But it is being very explicit there, because I've had a lot of people wondering why clubs and classes and groups can't start from the 12th of April, which we first thought that was going to be allowed. But that's just to show that they can't take place until 17th of May. So the next slide, Emma, please. So this slide is to recap social distancing, and this is going to be in the updated Appendix D when that comes out from ACRE. So we're in step 1 now, which means 2 people can meet and sit outdoors in a public space. But again, social distancing still has to take place. And as from Monday, it becomes the rule of 6. The rule of 6 means they don't have to be from the same household. And ideally, even if you are in a group of 6, you should still keep that 2 meters social distancing. It doesn't mean that that group of 6 can start hugging and holding hands. It does still mean that you're allowed to be in a group of 6 people that are from different households, but they're still socially distanced as much as possible. stay-at-home rule is lifted, which hopefully that's good news. So step 2, which is the 12th of April, again, social distancing is to be maintained in all settings, so that's inside and outside. No indoor mixing will be allowed between different households. They're a little bit less stringent when it becomes weddings and wakes, because they know that more people from those that may be attending will be from the same household. So it's not quite so, you know, the regulations are not quite as stringent for those sort of events. But it's still only up to 15 people. But from step 2, parent and toddler groups can start taking place in village halls, whereas before it was just supervised activities. This is more informal parent and toddler groups that maybe just run as a group, not run by a supervised trainer or a teacher or a nursery school teacher. So that's easing that up a little bit. So a lot of village halls do host things like parent and toddler groups, so they can take place from April the 12th, which is good news. And then step 3, which is May the 17th, there will be allowing more controlled indoor events, such as film shows, concerts, shows, that sort of thing. And the idea of up to 50% capacity is confusing. We've had quite a few inquiries about that, but we'll come on to that. So it isn't, we've got to take a cautious approach, and it's up to 50% capacity, we believe, for things like larger events where people are sat maybe in rows rather than mingling and in groups. So there will be further clarity on that. And it has to be run by a business, charity, public body, or similar organisation. And obviously within the COVID secure capacity limits of the hall. But it is still a very cautious approach, so don't think straight away that halls can have up to 50% capacity at step 3. I think more information is going to come out about that, or a little bit more clarity about that will come out. It does seem strange that to go from step 3, which is still quite cautious, to suddenly at step 4, June the 21st, and the government have been saying, you know, there'll be no social distancing. So there's a big leap from step 3 to step 4. So we think that it's still got to be cautious, and that might change as time goes on. Okay, so next slide, please. With the unlocking again, and it's going back to the basics that we've been taught, or you know, government have been getting this message across strongly over the last year, and it's really, this has got to continue. This is still the overarching safety measure, you know, that has got to be maintained. So obviously hand washing, hand hygiene, wearing of face coverings, and keeping the social distancing, keeping the space. But also later last year, they came out with the idea of ventilation. It was like another 4th overarching safety measure, which for village halls will be a lot easier because we're coming into spring and into the summertime. So it's going to be like hands, face, space, and open windows or open doors as well, much as possible. But don't, as we come out, do not forget that your hall users have still got to follow these measures. You know, wearing face coverings inside is still a legal requirement. That has not been removed with this unlocking, but it's easy to think that it has. So just to remind you that those are still overarching safety measures to adhere to. Next slide, Emma. Right, so Some of the slides, I've put it as questions and answers. So I thought this is a good way to illustrate some of the questions that have been raised nationally, not just with RAD. So why can't yoga, dog training, art classes, etc., which are conducted in a socially distanced manner, so why can't they start on the 12th of April? And the answer, ACRE isn't sure why this is the case, as in what is the rationale for that. Gyms and village halls can't host exercise classes before the 17th of May. So we know that you cannot have groups, WI groups, any sort of group or activity before the 17th of May. Gyms, even though they can open from the 12th of April, it's only for individual one-to-one sessions. They're not open, the doors are not open for all their people and members to go back. So even though gyms are open, halls are wondering why they can't do it. It's because it's actually only individual one-to-one session that gyms are allowed to do, or a single household. So we could argue that if you've got a one-to-one session happening in the village hall, then that probably would be okay to go ahead, because we're comparing it with what is allowed in the gym. So if you've got somebody who says, yes, I want to go in, there's one tutor and there's only one person or one household having that session, that should be okay to do that. It's talking about groups and classes. Most exercise activities are running classes. So that can't take place until the 17th of May. So that's the distinction, is the fact that it is one-to-one or one tutor to a single household. So next question, can outdoor exercise classes take place from the 29th of March, which is Monday? They can. They will be permitted as long as it's a social distancing rule of the rule of 6, and it's organised, it's outdoor organised grassroots sport. So it's not just people having a bit of fun, and it's not an organised activity. So if it's a properly organised event, then it can return. So an outdoor activity is much safer. So provided an exercise class is organised in accordance with the rule of 6, a larger number of people should be able to take part. Plus, they've also got to follow the guidance from their national governing body, their EMD. So if they're not sure whether they can go ahead, it's up to the group or the individuals to check with their governing body. So if it's, for example, a Zumba or yoga class and they're doing it outside, they would need to check what the restrictions, what they can and can't do from their governing body. It's not up to the village hall to tell them what their governing body is allowing. It's up to them to check that themselves. Next slide, Emma, please. So from the 12th of April, that's when step 2 is expected on that date. It's not guaranteed that these steps are going to take place on these dates. What the government have said is that they're leaving 5 weeks between each step, and after 4 weeks, they're going to review how, what the state of the R number is, and other factors. They're going to review whether they can then go into the next step. So there's no guarantee that step 2, and especially there could be changes to step 3 and step 4. So I think we've got to have a little bit of caution about talking about these things. We can't guarantee that this is what's going to happen. So still at this stage, classes, art classes, WI, craft groups, parish council meetings, etc. are still not permitted in the village hall. So outdoor activities mainly, okay to go ahead, but indoor leisure, we've already mentioned that gyms can do one-to-one, or a tutor to one household. So we're assuming that can happen in a village hall. So obviously it's the rule of 6 or 2 households, and it's still saying outdoors at this stage. No household mixing indoors. Now, village halls can, it's going up for weddings and wakes from step 2. You can have 15 people rather than the 6 at the last step. So there's a few more people allowed in the hall. And they can be served food if they're sat down. Ideally, they say they should be seated so that there's less mingling taking place. Social distance as per separate households. They should be socially distanced. So even though restaurants and hotels are still not open, they can, village halls are allowed to host a wedding reception up to 15 people, and they can serve food. So there is a slight difference there between hotels and pubs and restaurants and the village hall. It's a little bit more lenient there. Now, these slides, which I'm showing the steps, they're not designed for village halls. These are the generic government slides. So it has got the libraries and community centres, and that's the bit that caused the confusion, where it says that libraries and community centres can open from the 12th of April. So do bear that in mind. That's the bit that we're saying, hang fire, it's the 17th of May, when most of the village hall activities can take place. But of course, shops and hairdressers and retail will be open, which I think we're all looking forward to. Some of those other things there are not relating to village halls. I'm not going to talk about those. And it looks like the government are going to be piloting larger gatherings and larger events. So that's something that we're going to be hearing more about, to see the numbers, the capacities of what will be allowed inside venues for shows, concerts, things like that. But through all of the steps, there's no dancing allowed at all, which is surprising. There's no dancing allowed up to step 4. So we'll come on to that as well. Right, next slide, please. Right, so here. There's been a lot of support groups, and this was talked about even when it was the lockdown. So these support groups were allowed to take place during lockdown. Yes, so those that have to be delivered in person, so there's got to be somebody who's officially organising the group, can continue with up to 15 people, and it's got to be formally organised by a business, charitable, benevolent or philanthropic institution or a public body to provide mutual aid, therapy or any other form of support to its members or those who attend. So here is a list of the types of support groups that have been eligible: victim support, domestic abuse, addiction such as alcohol, narcotics or other substance abuse, rehabilitation of offenders, pre and postnatal support groups, stroke club, dementia support, LGBT issues, bereavement, vulnerable young people, etc. So that just illustrates that a support group is an official for health, for mental well-being, for safety reasons. They could have been able to take place throughout lockdowns as well. Lots of questions were raised about slimming groups, Weight Watchers and Slimming World. Are they classed as support groups? And there's no definitive answer, but it is doubtful. So we've been advising that they don't take place. ACRE have been advising that they don't take place. Given that members may inherently be vulnerable as they are overweight. Preferable that they are not run as support groups. Weight Watchers are recommending that the only way around it is to go, maybe use a village hall to do one-to-one weighing in. So if you phase when people go in and be weighed, that's absolutely fine. And if somebody can't access, say, IT, can't go online, perhaps they can have a session advising and talking and chatting about the diets and what have you, but on a one-to-one. But then the tutor might do more of a social talk gathering online. So that is what they're recommending at this stage, that Weight Watchers and Slimming Worlds, they're not classed as a support group. I think that has caused some confusion. But again, it's looking at the governing body of these organisations. It's not for ACRE to say it is up to that governing body, because they're following the guidance and regulations that are coming down from various government departments themselves. Next slide, please. So we're on to step 3. And this is where more activities can take place, traditional activities that take place in village halls. So this is where you can do film shows, plays, concerts, community cafe, coffee morning, parish council meetings, indoor sports, exercise classes, team sports, indoor bowls, the badminton, all the traditional things you'd expect to take place in a village hall. As far as we know, unless things change, these can go back to how they probably normally are, but obviously all the COVID rules have to be still adhered to. So again, the rule of 6 or 2 households can form their own sort of little group. And the idea about the rule of 6, I mean, for those halls that did implement it last year, we changed from the 2 metre social distancing for everybody, and then the government introduced the idea of the rule of 6, which meant that that group of 6 people could form their little group, but should still be socially distanced 2 metres from each other. But they must not mingle or go across the room and talk to anybody or mingle with anybody in another group. So it's just containing small numbers of people in groups of 6. And that's what they're saying again this time, that they've brought this rule of 6 back. And it's up to whoever is organising the event to manage their attendees or their members in their group. So if they've got groups of 6 people, that they stay in their groups. The easiest way to manage it, for example, if they're doing a craft session or it's a social, is to have tables where a group of 6 people can sit round a table and then try and stay at that table. So they're not getting up, walking across the room and having a chat with somebody from another table in another group. They're meant to stay. Obviously, they might want to go to the toilets or come and go out the main entrance, but they're not to mix with other groups. So it's no mingling. Ideally, refreshments would be served to the table rather than people getting up and down and going, across the hall. There's so many variables to this because it depends how many people you've got, what the capacity of your hall is for COVID secure reasons, and what the layout of your room is another variable. So it's very hard to generalise. There is a lot of information about that, all of these issues in the ACRE information sheet, and I'm only just literally touching on it very, very briefly, but just trying to remind people of the things that they need to be aware of. Where it goes down to the middle bottom, where it says where there's the ticket, it's more bigger events will hopefully be allowed to take place. So weddings, funerals, funeral wakes, birthday parties can take place now at this stage. Christenings, life events can take place, and it's up to 30 people can attend at this stage. But larger events, inside and outside, inside a maximum of 1,000 people or 50% capacity indoors. So I think they're going to do these to see how there's any effect on the spread of the virus. So it's probably still a little bit cautionary at this stage. And they'll monitor that at stage 3 to see if there's going to be the complete lifting at stage 4. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, this is causing a bit of confusion in the guidance. What does up to 50% capacity mean for controlled indoor events from the 17th of May? Previously, halls followed the 2-metre social distancing rule, which often meant reducing capacity to 25%. So that was like halls had to work out their COVID secure numbers, the capacity, and it was about 25% of their normal capacity. We think halls have to still go by that. So the answer that ACRE have said is that this is at present, it's unclear, but it appears that events and activities organised by a business, charity, public body or similar organisation can be held within the COVID secure capacity limits of a hall, which is like the 25%, which allows for the social distancing. But this is the caveat, is that controlled performance events, when you're looking at things like shows, concerts, films, that's what controlled performance events. Ideally, people would be seated in rows for those sort of events. And that's where it means it might be permitted with up to 50% capacity. So don't think that 50% capacity is allowed for your normal activities. It's just for those controlled performance events. So still go by the rule of thumb of capacity of 25% normal capacity. Does that make sense? I think there'll be more guidance coming out, more clarity on that when we do get to stage 3. So I shouldn't be too concerned about that yet. So hopefully we'll get more information. Next slide. Yes, this is just to illustrate social distancing, and this is Tansley Village Hall back in July when the first lockdown was eased and halls could reopen from the 4th of July. And Tansley were one of the first to get a group going back into the hall. Emma took this picture back in July. And this is just demonstrating that the layout of the room, they got people sitting a good 2 meters away at tables, wearing face coverings and quite happily having able to have a social activity and do their lace making session. So that was a good way to illustrate that. Next slide, Emma, please. So this is a question about the rule of 6, and effectively, does it mean the capacity of a hall is restricted to 12 people at step 3? The answer is no. It means that people cannot mingle or mix, which we've already mentioned, in groups of more than 6 individuals or 2 households. And we've already mentioned the ideal way to manage groups of 6 is to have people seated at tables if possible. It's less easy to manage groups of 6 people if you've got people standing in groups of 6. There may be occasions where that would happen, but it's not easy for the event organizer to manage those. And ideally, they should still be 2 meters apart. unless people are seated back to back, it's perhaps not so important. And we've already mentioned that 2 households can be more than 6 people. So it's got that example there. You could have a house of 4 and 3 or 5 and 2 or whatever. So it's very difficult for the event organizer, when people are arriving at an event or a club or something, to manage this, because they're going to have to ask, in a way, are you 6 people from separate households, or are you 2 households? I mean, if you know people in a community and you know the families and you know who they are, that's not quite so difficult. But for an event organizer, and you've got people coming to an event, how are you going to know if they are, you know, which households they're going to come from? So it may be that when they book, if you do an advanced booking system, you ask, are this number of people from the same household? And then you can record it. And then when they arrive at the event, you can tick off, yes, that household or those 2 households have arrived together, and they're going to sit in that corner of the room. And we know that even though they're more than 6 people, potentially, we know that that's legal because they are coming from 2 households. So it's not easy to manage. But I think it is the event organizer that has to be made aware that it is their responsibility to manage that. And avoid any sharing of equipment between groups of 6 people. So if it's a craft type of activity, you're not passing scissors and you know, whatever you're using, you're not passing it from table to table, because that defeats the object as well. Next slide then, please. So if a hall has a COVID secure capacity of 25, can a wedding for 30 take place at step 3? Yes, it can, because even though your building may be set that your COVID secure capacity is based at 25% of the usual seating capacity, it's a cautious approach. So I think just for weddings and family events, this can slightly be eased, and that's why the government are increasing the amount of guests that can are allowed to go to wedding and funeral wakes as well. And the reason for that is that guests attending those sort of events tend to be from the same limited number of households. So for example, if you've got a wedding and there's only 30 people there, you might have only 4 or 5 households going. So there's less risk of transmission between groups of people. And they will be seated as well. So the government is allowing more to attend weddings and wakes than necessarily what the capacity, COVID secure capacity is of the hall, if that makes sense. I think that would only affect if it's a very small hall and it's got a very, very small COVID secure capacity. So bigger venues, I wouldn't even worry about those limits. So can village halls host weddings and wedding receptions up to 15 at step 2 when hotels and restaurants cannot? The answer is yes. I think we've already mentioned this. The roadmap makes it clear that community centres can open at step 2 specifically for this purpose. Wedding receptions and other life events up to 30 are allowed from the 17th of May, step 3. And hopefully at step 4, the limit goes altogether, but we've got to wait to see what happens. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, this is just before coffee break. Another picture that Emma kindly has taken outside Tansley. You may have seen this picture on our website. And this was introducing people queuing up before they went into the village hall, obviously social distance and wearing their masks. So there's nothing new. I think we've become so accustomed to that, queuing up for supermarkets and things like that. But this was innovative at the time because it was the first unlocking, and they managed to get that those procedures in place very quickly. But that was a good example of the measures that halls had to take. Okay, and it's just gone 11, so we're going to have a coffee break. Any questions so far of the things that we've covered? I don't mind if you put your hand up. Nothing in chat has come through. Everybody's keen to have a cup of coffee, I think.
Can I just confirm one thing?
Okay.
The one-to-one personal training that can happen indoors, what date was that?
If I remember, at step 2, gyms are allowed to open.
Yeah.
But it's only for one-to-one. So it's not like they're open normally. So in theory, then that would be allowed in a village hall. It has to be one-to-one only.
Yeah.
So it couldn't be a normal class.
It's just
or a household.
Yeah. We have a martial arts group that are meeting outdoors at the moment on a one-to-one, one household. And I just wanted to confirm what stage they could come into the hall. Okay.
Halls can be used. Say, for example, you've got a badminton court or table tennis tables. We can't see any problem with a single household going in. So people of the same family could go in to use the hall. But then they have to make sure that they clean down anywhere that they've touched.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's all the precautions they have to take place, but there's no reason if it's not going against any of the social distancing regulations, there's no reason why they can't do that.
Okay, thank you.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Helena. We've got one from Jan Warwick asking, would it be possible to have a copy of the very helpful presentation for reference after?
It won't be straight away. It might be a couple of days because Emma is recording this, and by the time, it takes time to get all the to get it done properly. You'll all get the slides and a link to the recording as well.
There's also a question from Joanne who said, when would viewings or show rounds of the hall be able to take place? For example, showing a couple round for a wedding or party.
I think that could take place. Let me just think, because from Monday people are allowed to leave their homes. The lockdown from that is allowed. Volunteers and managers of community buildings are allowed to go into the village hall now because they're managing the hall. That's a legitimate purpose. So as long as they're socially distanced and it's only the 2 people, or no more than 2 households, I think then that would be okay. They should be allowed to do that.
And there's also another question from Jane who's asked, can we use the toilets in our hall for 6 people who are taking part in an outdoor activity in the grounds?
I think you can make the toilets available. Is that now, or is that, so when groups of 6 people are allowed, which is from Monday, isn't it? The group of 6 from Monday. So they should be allowed to use the toilets. It's at the discretion of the village hall committee trustees. Do they normally allow the public to use the toilets? So if it's something that they would normally do, then yes, they can still make the toilets available and access those.
And
there shouldn't be a problem.
And Lee's asked if the QR codes are mandatory mandatory for the track and trace?
My understanding is that yes, track and trace is still a requirement as part of the COVID secure premises. So if they haven't got QR code posters put up, it is the event organiser's responsibility to make sure that they have the names and the contact details of everybody attending the event. Mm-hmm. Because it's all about, isn't it, tracking and tracing where people have been. So it's either QR codes, and if not, but that is still a requirement. The government are still putting that system is still in place for tracking people and tracking the virus.
And Joanne's also asked, she says, thank you very much, but she's also said, from which date would you suggest show rounds, etc.? Would it be Monday the 29th?
I'm not 100% certain without going back through all the ins and outs of it all, but I mean, unless they're wanting to desperately go in the next few days, let me just, I think they probably would be okay now. Wait a minute. It depends if they're people from the same household, to be honest. But even now, from the 8th of March, 2 people will be able to meet in outdoor public spaces. So maybe not, maybe leave it till Monday. This is where it might be safer to leave it till Monday.
And that's all the questions.
Yeah, but if there's anything different, I can get back. Can you remember who it was that asked that question?
That was Joanne Maxwell.
Okay, we'll try and confirm that, Joanne. Okay. Because the government, the guidelines is actually saying 2 people outside only. But it is actually more, it's part of the business, isn't it? It's part of the village hall business. So the volunteer managing the village hall will be allowed in. I mean, I personally think it's okay, but we'll double check. I think we'll double check on that one.
Can I just add something that if people are currently having to go into their place of work and mingle with other people in that place of work, then community COVID testing is available. So you don't have to have symptoms, and you can be tested twice a week. And there are testing stations now around Matlock. So I think that part of that is that it is a work-based activity. So I think that providing community COVID testing took place as well as a sort of an extra layer of protection that might be worth investigating.
Yeah, and there are various places where there is the community testing available, so you'd have to be aware of where that is. Probably more near the urban areas. I mean, I know Matlock is, but that's nowhere near where I live. So if I need community testing, I've got to go 15, 16 miles to Matlock, you know. It's not that, there's not a lot of them around, but if you're near a bigger town centres and things, it's going to be more
But
available.
I think also I've heard on the radio that the government is making making testing available to places of work, businesses. So it might again be worth investigating your village hall as a business and being able to get some tests to your
We'll look into that. Thank you, Emma. We'll look into that as well, and we can perhaps make that some information on that available as well. Okay. Right.
And that's all the questions.
Right, we'll have a break, no longer than 10 minutes, and have a chance to stretch your legs and then make a cup of coffee.
Okay.
And we'll see you
at 23 minutes past 11.
Exactly.
Okay.
Oops, I'm steaming up my glasses. It's no good. Right, we can start again. Yeah, I think most people are back, aren't they? So they are. Right, so the next slide. It's where we left off, really. Oh dear. Right, yeah. So that's where we left off before coffee break. Again, that was another one at Tansley. And that just illustrates the lady on the right hand side. She was like monitoring the flow of people coming in and out the hall and reminding them to use the hand gel as they went into the hall. And this was really early days. This was like new behaviour that everybody had to get used to. I mean, it's sort of ingrained in us now. But when you think back to what it was like in July last year, we found it very strange. And everybody was quite unsure what they should and shouldn't be doing. So that was just a good illustration of how they'd got it into place very, very quickly. Right, so we'll go on to some more questions here. So again, we're obviously still in step 3, is where most of the activities can take place. So the question, concerts can be held from the 17th of May, which we've mentioned, but is a band permitted to rehearse in advance of this? But what about amateur dramatics clubs, which a lot of village halls will have clubs using the hall for that purpose? So the regulations say that training and rehearsal without an audience is permitted if it's professional musicians and actors only. And that's in accordance with the guidance for performing arts, including for film. But when you're talking about amateur groups, amateur dramatic groups, then they can't. They are expected, so AmDrams are expected that they can rehearse from the 17th of May and with performances starting from the 21st of June. So the distinction between the two there is whether it's a professional musician and actors or amateur dramatics. So that's a very valid question, but it's knowing the distinction between the two. So the next question is, can dancing take place at a wedding held after the 17th of May and before the 21st of June, when up to 30 people can attend? The answer, the bridal couple could have a first dance under last year's guidance. So it was just the bride and the groom having a first dance. So a bridal dance is expected to be allowed from the 12th of April. However, because nightclubs can't open until step 4, which is the 21st of June, so no other dancing should take place in halls until then. So even though wedding receptions of either, the 6, the 15 or the 30 at step 3 are allowed, nobody can dance apart from the bride and groom having their bridal dance. So it's not much of a party, is it really, for a wedding reception? But that's the regulation, that dancing is still a no-go area until 21st of June at the earliest, because we still don't know what the step 3 and step 4 is actually going to look like in reality. So that's quite a valid question as well. Next slide, please. So hopefully coming on to step 4, where we can do whatever we like according to the government. But they do say that they're hoping to be able to introduce these lifting of restrictions. It's a hope at this stage, and I think it's very, very tentative, very early days yet. And they're saying no earlier than the 21st of June. So this step 4 can be put back. It's not set in stone by any shape or form. But they're hoping that when it gets to step 4, whenever that will be, there will be no legal limit on social distancing at events. So you could go back to your normal capacity for your community building, your village hall. And at this stage, dancing will be allowed because nightclubs can open, and all remaining businesses, they can all open at this stage. Larger events. But if you notice, under every one of these 5 activities, in brackets, it does say subject to review. So I think the government are planning to do an events research programme during April and May. And the results from that, I think it's these pilot concerts and outdoor events, all sorts of things. They're piloting different things, and this is all going to inform the review that they're going to do. And whatever the outcome is from the review will determine whether step 4 can take place on the 21st of June, or whether part of step 4 can take place and not all of it. We don't know at this stage. I mean, that to us, it's sort of not that far away in a way. So there's got to be a lot of changes between now and June for that to allow for that to happen. So a lot can happen in between that, between now and then. Okay, next slide, please. So we've already mentioned this, haven't we? But just to reiterate that dance floors and nightclubs are not permitted to open before June the 21st at the earliest. Loud music isn't permitted either. So performances are advised not to encourage impromptu dancing by audiences. So if there are performances from the 17th of May, then the event organizer has to ensure that you know, they can control the attendees and that they don't just get up and start dancing. And also singing is still banned before step 4, so there should be no group singing by worshippers or audiences. The definition of an event, Pete, is anything that happens in the village hall. So say for instance, if it's a wedding reception, that would be classed as an event. They're not meant to dance. If you've got an event which you're allowed to have performances and concerts from the 17th of May, so the idea is that you could have things like that where people are sat in rows, so you're an audience, so you're not meant to get up and participate. You can watch a concert or a play or a film, but you are controlled because you're sat socially distanced in rows of people or sat round tables watching an event. So the event organizer is controlling the attendees at an event. So I hope that makes sense. Yes, a meeting, a class, anything that's taking part, you can class. It's like a booking, really. Class the event as a booking, so anything that's taking place in your hall. A meeting, as you say, and not that anybody at a meeting would want to impromptu get up and have a dance, that's very doubtful, but yes, it is that. Essentially it's saying that anything that's taking place in the hall is, in essence, it's an event, if that makes sense. Okay, so next slide. Right, so going back to you as trustees and managers of village halls, it's your responsibility to make sure that the event organizer or the hirer knows what is their responsibility. So that's why there is this additional Appendix E. Going back to the information sheet, it's all written down in Appendix E, and it's called the special conditions of hire. So these are over and above the terms and conditions that you would normally have for your village hall. So all village halls should have some standard terms and conditions when they're hiring out their hall anyway. So when COVID came along, obviously there are legal requirements, and so you've got to specify to the hirer what those special conditions are. So that's, I've just listed down sort of the main things. There will be a few more on the in Appendix E. So it's up to the event organizer to make sure that they're not having more people than you are allowing in the hall to allow social distancing. So you will set your capacity, your COVID secure capacity, and then it's up to the hirer to say we're not going to go above that number, so that they can keep the social distancing, and they are to follow all the measures that you've put in place. So it may be that you've got a one-way system set up, whatever you have got up in the hall for accessing, say, the toilets. The hirer is aware of these measures, and it also, because the group of 6 and things like that, it's the hirer's responsibility to prevent the mingling between groups or different household groups.
Eleanor, just a quick question on that. Someone's asked, should the trustee be present to monitor this activity?
No. They don't have to be, but that's the beauty of the hiring agreement. The hiring agreement, in essence, not because of COVID, but any time, a hiring agreement is a contract between the village hall committee and the hirer. So, you know, it's the terms of the contract. When you sign the hiring agreement, you are agreeing to abide to our terms. Now, obviously, COVID, there are a lot more because of the health risks and the risk of spreading the virus. You've had to make these special terms of condition of hire, but it isn't the trustee's responsibility to make sure that the hirer complies with them. But what the trustees can do, if the trustees feel that that hirer or that group is not going to implement these special conditions, they can turn down or cancel terminate the contract. If they feel that they're not capable, or they're just going to totally disregard everything that you've got in your special conditions of hire, the trustees would be wise to say, I'm sorry, you can't have the hall. Right. If you're confident that you know the group and you think they're going to, they know that they're going to follow these rules, no, it's not the trustees responsible to monitor it. It's the event organiser's responsibility. And they have signed the contract to say, I'm taking responsibility. So if anything goes wrong, that is not a negligence of the village hall, then it is down to the hirer, and they have signed that, agreeing that it's their responsibility to do that.
And also, have these conditions changed since the last reopening? Steve's asked as well.
It's a good question, that is, because I would expect that they would, but so far ACRE haven't said that they've updated it. As far as I'm aware, they're updating the Appendix D, which is a social distancing appendix. But if it doesn't, then the last updated one, I think, was December. So it may well be that the conditions in there are absolutely adequate and they're perfectly okay and still apply. But they are still required to cover you as trustees, and also to prove that in writing, because the hirer will have a copy of this, either sent to them electronically or handed to them. So they can't say, we didn't know that we should be doing this. We didn't realise we had to make sure that our attendees wear face coverings, because you can turn around and say, yes, you did know. You signed the contract, you had a copy of the special conditions, and it's up to you to implement those. So it's very clear that the trustees are not having to check every single group when they're on their premises to see that they're abiding. There's nothing to stop you going checking. I can't see a problem with that, but it's not your responsibility to have to monitor that. I think the only thing I can say is if you don't feel confident that that particular group or that hirer are going to take these conditions seriously, then you would just say, I'm sorry, you cannot hire the hall. And that's all you can do, really. So the event organiser or the hirer would really, I can't see a problem with them maybe asking if they can access the hall to have a look at the hall if they're not familiar with it prior to the event, so they can work out where they may want to set the tables up, how they're going to manage the numbers that are going to attend the event. That's probably quite a good idea if they don't know the hall, so that in advance they're not sort of, in advance they can work out where they're going to put tables or where they're going to manage the groups of 6 or the different households. how they can access a toilet safely. Are you going to let one table at a time, you know, access the toilets, or are they going to be allowed into the kitchen, or are you going to have somebody providing drinks and bringing drinks and refreshments to the tables? They can work all of those things out in advance, because otherwise at the event it's just going to go haywire. But that's their responsibility. So things like the QR codes and recording names and contact details, we've already sort of, that's been flagged up okay. Obviously it's the hall's responsibility to have the hand gels, paper towels, tissues, everything in place. Cleaning requirements, that you might have to have extra cleaning materials and products to hand. Make it clear what you expect them to do. This is all in the conditions of hire, so you're expecting them that before, during and after to wipe down frequently touched surfaces. I mean, these are things that groups don't normally have to think about under normal circumstances. So COVID secure conditions are, you know, not the norm. Groups wouldn't normally expect to do this, but, you know, it's their responsibility to know what their responsibilities are, if you see what I mean. Your responsibility to make sure they sign and have a copy of the special conditions of hire. Yeah, okay. Does that make sense? I mean, if anybody wants, you know, to answer questions at the end of the session or after today, all of these appendices as well are available to download from our website. They're all freely available. There's no charge. You can just go on our website and download these documents. So if you haven't already got them, we do encourage you to go and do that.
Eleanor,
And if any of them...
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, Sky, yeah.
Someone's just asked, are there, on the cleaning requirements and stuff, they've asked, are there any recommendations for automatic hand sanitizers? Just while you're on that topic.
Never been asked that question. I don't know, we'd have to look into that. What do you mean? So people are not actually touching the dispenser, so it's like an automatic thing?
I think they mean the sensor ones.
Yeah, I suppose that's an ideal, but I don't think it's a legal requirement that you have that in place. If the hall want to invest in something like that, that is up to them. I mean, obviously, if you've had the grants, the COVID grants, and you feel that that's something that you can now afford to put in place, then by all means go ahead. But I don't think it's a legal requirement to have it. It's probably good practice to make and moving forward for, you know, like they're saying that COVID's going to be around. It might be a virus that comes back every winter, like the flu does. So thinking about not just for COVID, but, you know, the annual viruses that go around, it might be good practice anyway, even though it's not legally binding, a good practice to, you know, get round to having these eventually. All community public buildings perhaps ought to have that sort of, you know, the less physical contact with anything, the better. But it's not a legal requirement that I'm aware of anyway at this stage. But by all means, go ahead and do it if you've got the money to do it. Right, so next slide. I think the next slide is to do with ventilation. You know, we've talked about the hands, face, base. At the end of last year, in the autumn, they were talking a lot more about ventilation to reduce the risk of, you know, aerobic particles of the virus. And I think that's going to be a lot easier now. We're coming into spring and summer, so doors, windows, it's quite easy to have a lot more ventilation through buildings. It was much harder in the winter to do that. But it does make a difference, and that's what the government have been reiterating, that it does make a big difference to have good ventilation. So do bear that in mind. yeah, also poses issues if using aircon. You're probably right, Pete. I don't know enough about that because it can circulate. It's the circulation, recirculation of the air, isn't it? I think to do with the aircon. I'm not technically, I know it's a question that's been raised nationally, but I don't know much about it to comment on that. But there's a lot of information online, and I can find out information if anybody has a specific question they want us to find out about. We can do that at a later date. I don't think emergency doors should be open. If that's what you mean, in the fire doors, I think they should still remain closed. That's my understanding of that. Again, I'm not an expert on the ventilation side. But we can send you links to government guidance on ventilation, which is, I think it might also be on our website. There's some very good guidance around that because it's an issue that all buildings, you know, office spaces, public buildings, it's something that everybody's had to sort of get their head around, ventilation and aircon, that sort of thing. But I'm no expert on it. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is another one you can get on our website and download. If you've not already seen this, this was something that Acre had published last year in partnership with an organisation called If Do and Clarion Futures. I think they're sort of architectural designers and things like that, so they know a lot about buildings, and they did this guide, and it's a visual guide. So it's illustrating, I should have had a slide to show you actually. I've done it in a past presentation and I should have remembered to put a slide in here, but I'd forgotten about it. And it shows you like different scenarios. So for example, if you've got one room and one entrance, it's showing you perhaps how you can manage people coming and going from your building, and maybe how you can set out a one-way system, or how you would set up signage for toilets and, you know, kitchen facilities within the building. But then it might be an example of facilities that got several rooms and maybe more than one entrance. Again, how you would manage the flow of people to avoid, you know, to maintain that social distancing. I don't know if any of you have used that, but it is a good guide to refer to. Okay, so the next slide, please. Okay, I think most village halls and other types of community buildings will have looked into this, and hopefully majority will have had some financial support. So this first slide shows you what grants have been available up to the end of March this year, because new grants have been announced in the budget to take us through beyond March 21. And that will help come out of lockdown. So the help that halls have had so far, even though they're exempt from paying rates or very limited rates, because it depends on which local authority area you're located in. A lot of halls don't pay any rates anyway. Some halls have to pay 20% of their rateable value, which is still quite a low amount. So if you were in the category of having to pay 20%, then the whole of last year, there's been no business rates to pay. So that's helped village halls greatly. Then the grants that have been available during the third lockdown, which has been called the Closed Businesses Lockdown Payment. And again, this is for properties that have got a rateable value. So if your rateable value has been 15,000 or less than 15,000, you could get £4,000 lockdown payment grant. If it was been 15 to 51,000 rateable value, it's been the 6,000, and then over 51,000 rateable value, you've been entitled to a grant of £9,000. When the first lockdown grants were out, I had no end of inquiries. Lots of people were contacting us about these grants, and we helped a lot to work through that. But I've not had any inquiries in the third lockdown. So from that, all I can do is assume that people are getting the grants that they're entitled to. I've had no inquiries whatsoever. If, however, you were not aware of these and you're saying, well, actually, we didn't know about them, perhaps we should be getting that grant, you need to act very quickly, because the deadline is the 31st of March. So that's next week. So please do make sure you've had the grant, or if you've applied for it and there's been a good reason why you've not been entitled to it, then that would be, I don't think it's mandatory. There has to be certain criteria. But my understanding is that most village halls should be entitled to that if they've got that rateable value. There has been confusion because people like buildings that are church halls or statutory managed halls don't have a rateable value, in which case they should have been able to get some of the additional support grant, because that's to cover businesses that don't fall under the rating system, and it's called a discretionary grant that the local authorities have the power to administer, to hand out at their discretion. So just be aware that for this financial year, make sure as much as possible that you've claimed for the grants that you believe you should be getting, because it's time limited, and that's coming up quite quickly now. But also before Christmas, when we were in the tier system, there was financial support available under the local restrictions support grant, and again that's for businesses that have got a rateable value. So for every fortnight that you were shut down because of the tier restrictions, there was payout. So if the lowest payout for that, for a rateable value of 15,000 or less, was £667 per fortnight. So for however many weeks you were shut down in December, can't remember when the third lockdown started, or under the tier system, which was in November, then there could be small pockets of funding there that you need to look into, because if you haven't had it, you may still be entitled to get that money. And it is quite complex. I looked on Derbyshire Dale District Council's business support pages last week, and it is actually, I'm not saying they're any different to any other local authority, but the whole system is very, very complicated. So I think if you don't know what you're doing and you look at it, you might just say, I'm going to forget this, I can't get my head around it. I always think if you can get hold of them by the telephone, if you're really not sure, pick up the phone, say, I want to put through to the business support grants, and explain your situation, that you've got a rateable value, a rates number, you are a rateable property, we haven't applied for these, would we have been, are we eligible still to apply for them? That's probably the quickest and easiest way to get around it at this stage, because otherwise you might be missing any deadline that they've set. And each local authority is administering it slightly different, so I can't be generic about how each local authority is managing the business support grants. But one example last year, when it was the retail, hotel and leisure grant for the first lockdown, and halls were entitled to £10,000, which we thought was a huge amount of money for the first lockdown. I had a call from a hall, it was based in Erewash actually, that phoned me the night before the deadline It was really, really last minute, and said, you know, are we entitled to apply for this grant? And I said, well, yes, you know, get on to the Erewash Borough Council the next day and apply for it. You know, the deadline was the next day, and they did. And then it came back, sorry, you're not entitled. And it ended up that the Borough Council hadn't got them on the rate system. They were not registered with the rate system, but they should have been registered with the rate system. So with a bit of toing and froing and evidence that they were actually a charity and not a statutory managed and owned hall, Erewash Borough Council very quickly rectified that, and then they had £10,000 transferred into their bank account. But it was challenging it. It was challenging the fact that they got the information wrong. And this could happen in any local authority, and it can happen to any hall. So if you've applied and had some sort of negative, or you're not eligible, and you think actually that you are, do challenge it. Do challenge it, because it's like in any walks of life, mistakes can be made. And also the same with things like parish councils as a sole trustee, which some halls are under that format. They should still have a rateable number, and a lot of parish councils have thought we can't apply because we're a statutory body, but they're actually managing a charity. And I've helped several to get that £10,000, and you know, it's challenging it sometimes, because it's just misunderstanding sometimes about what sort of organisation you are. Have you got a rateable value or not? You know, a lot of halls say we don't pay rates, so we haven't got a rateable value. That's not the case. You should have a rateable value, even though you're exempt from paying the rates. So do be aware of all of these things. Another thing to be aware of is sometimes the rates department may just literally have the wrong address for the hall. So they may have been sending letters out inviting people to apply, and it's just literally landed on the wrong doorstep. And the hall haven't thought we've not had a letter, that means we're not eligible, which isn't the case at all. It's just been a misunderstanding. So again, it's worth checking that your rates department have the correct contact for the hall. Because we all know that secretaries come and go, chairs come and go, and it's then actually making sure that any correspondence that comes to the hall is going to the current person that should be taking that correspondence. Right, next slide. So this is from April 2021. So these are the new grants that have been announced by the government to come out of lockdown. So this is anticipated what will happen during the uneasing of the restrictions. So the government have extended the business rates holiday to the end of June 2021. So that's good news for all sorts of businesses. But the grant packages that they've come up with, which is the Restart grant and the additional restriction support grant, the deadline or closing for applications, I believe, is the 30th of June. I mean, that might be different for local authority areas. It's early doors yet. We don't quite know how it's going to be administered. I don't think they're available. I don't think they're up and open to apply for yet. I think local authorities are just getting it all in place. They've just had the criteria from the government last week about these new grants. So they will be getting the information put on their websites shortly, I would imagine. So similar to the lockdown grant, the Restart grant, again, it's for properties that are rateable premises. They're designed to be a one-off grant, and the government are hoping that they don't have to pay out any more grants. They're hoping that this is the final lockdown, and, you know, fingers crossed, let's hope that's going to be the case. I don't know all of the eligibility criteria. but it does list on the information that they've sent to local authorities that village halls, scout huts, clubs, institutions, pavilions, cadet huts, etc. are going to be eligible. So it is actually written in their guidance. So, you know, you don't have to challenge them about eligibility. So again, it's based on the rateable value, and properties rates up to 15,000, if that's your rateable value, you should get £8,000. 15 to 51,000 rateable value, it's going to be 12,000, and then above 51 rateable value, it's going to be 18,000. So again, it's quite generous, especially for very small village halls. It's probably the grant packages are exceeding what you would normally have coming in. For maybe larger, busier halls, it may be a similar amount that you would normally have for income. Maybe for very large community centres, it may not be covering the income that you would normally get. So there may be some winners and some losers, but you know, the government have done all they can, I think, to keep businesses going through. But if you've got money, this COVID funding, you know, again, if you've had to adapt to the hall and buy things like the sensor soap dispensers, you know, you can't say that you couldn't afford it, because this grant money is there designed to help with these additional costs. The government also announced that they're going to have a loan scheme, or they're going to launch this recovery loan scheme, which will be open for businesses and voluntary community sector, but not for public sector. And there are loans between £25,000 and £10 million. So I don't know any more information on that at this stage, but I think more information will be made available in the coming weeks and months. Next slide, please. I think some halls have wondered, maybe we don't need this money. Should we apply? You know, you can refuse it. You don't have to have it, even if you are eligible. So it's not like I've got to take it. So the Charity Commission have come up with some advice on the Charity Commission website. So, and it's saying you should go through the decision-making process, which there's a guidance there. So I've given you that link to the Charity Commission guidance on making decisions, which applies the Charity Commission principles. So what they're saying is you can say no, but what you have to do is, as a trustee, always act in the best interests of the charity and the charity's purposes. So if you decided you didn't want to accept the grant, you've got to have a very, very good rationale. So any decision making, you need to record it in your minutes and the reason for making that decision. Going back to the first lockdown, I know of a hall that ethically they said, no, we don't want to apply for £10,000. We don't want to take that money from the government. It's far too much money. And, you know, they had to come to that decision. But how did they know that when we're going to come out of lockdown? How did they know when their normal hirers were going to come back? They didn't know. So it was admirable of them to say, no, we're not going to spend government money when we don't need it. But as it turned out, you know, we're a year down the line. So trustees have got to come up with a really good reason not to perhaps accept this money, because you don't know what might happen in the future. So bear that in mind. But also the link at the bottom there is to Charity Commission guidance that is on the gov.uk website, and it's all to do with coronavirus issues, guidance for charities, things like holding meetings or holding meetings online, holding an AGM. So again, that's a really useful link to have as well. Right, next slide. Time's getting on, isn't it now? This is very quickly, it's a government review. You know, they're talking about having a certificate or a vaccine passport. Is it going to be something that village halls might need in the future, or for travelling abroad or going into hotels or wherever? You know, are we going to have this sort of certification in the future to say that we're vaccinated? Well, they've not come to a decision yet, but what there is a review taking place at the moment. So it's a consultation, it's a call for evidence, and that finishes on Monday. So if you've got any comments to make from you know, the angle of managing a village hall that may help the government come to that decision about the certification, then you're very welcome to participate in that. It is a public consultation. So I thought I'd make you aware of that. Next slide. Right, ACRE, as I've said earlier, are updating Appendix D. What they're trying to do also, this is just to illustrate, please don't try and read it all, it's just to illustrate that they're trying to put into place like a spreadsheet that will list down, at the moment they've got 112 different types of activities listed in, this is only listing a few of them here, because I can only do one page to illustrate it. But those 4 columns in the middle with the ticks are representing step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. So if you see the list of activities down the left-hand side, for example, it says education and children. It's just a quick visual guide. For example, preschools and nurseries, tick, yes, they can operate at step 1, step 2, step 3 and 4. But as you move down, for example, out of school settings, things like breakfast club, homeschooling, in step 1, it's got a tick and then says limited. And that means that it was only allowed for children of key workers and vulnerable children were allowed to have breakfast club, homeschooling, and things like that in a village hall. So does that make sense? So if they could get this completed, I'm hoping that that's going to be made available to village halls to have a copy. So that's going to make it a lot easier for you to quickly look down, as I say, 112 different types of activities, which hopefully covers virtually everything we know takes place in village halls. And then you can look along the columns and see whether it's allowed or not allowed. So fingers crossed. You'll hear more about that moving forward. So next slide.
Eleanor, Pete Edwards has just asked if there's any guidance on staff or volunteers refusing to have a jab.
We've not had any, Pete. We've not had any guidance come through from ACRE. I know it's been talked about on the television when you hear the news, but we've not had anything come through yet. So unless the government come to a firm decision, whether it becomes something that is in law, we can't comment on that. It's a very, very sensitive area. I think village halls, if, I mean, you're talking about staff and volunteers, but say, for example, at events, you know, can you insist that everybody attending that event has had a jab until the review about this certification has been, you know, finalised, and we've got some guidance on that. But it might be reasonable that an event organiser could say that if there are people that haven't been vaccinated, maybe sit them in a corner. Sounds like they're in on the naughty seat. I don't mean that, but keep them slightly separated. You know, maybe more socially distanced. But it's very difficult how people manage that, because there's all sorts of ethical things come into it, and you can offend people, and there's privacy, things like that. So I can't comment how it's going to be managed into the future. Yeah. Right, so we're virtually finished and we've just gone past 12. I put this slide up here because this was a survey, a Mori poll survey that came out only yesterday, I believe. And it's only a short survey, about 2,500 people, but it was an interesting snapshot of changing behaviours coming out of COVID and what the new normal might be. So 40% people more, there's going to be more walking from home, more working from home, 32, shopping locally, more, 31, and cycling. We're only asked a limited number of questions, but it's interesting that all of those things, hopefully people will carry forward after COVID. It'll become the new normal, and less flying and less commuting. But I think it's a good way to illustrate that village halls and communities, shops, businesses can actually, you know, try and take advantage of these figures. More people working from home. Does that mean that they may have more time because they're not commuting? They may have more leisure time. Does it mean they need to, rather than having mingling and mixing with colleagues in the office, they may want to meet more of their local community? They may have some spare time that they could then volunteer to be a trustee. So it's looking at how you can, okay, look at the, I know we've been through a tough time, but there will be some positives coming out of it and some opportunities. And it's looking at how you may want to capitalise on the fact that, you know, more people are going to be working from home. You know, local shops, have you got a community shop? Is there a community cafe in your village hall? You know, more people are going to be using those sort of facilities, which is, you know, something that is something to look forward to in that respect. Cycling, you know, if you were in an area that's on a cycling route, for example, and you've got a village hall, you might want to capitalise on maybe providing services on a Saturday or Sunday to cater for cycling or cycling groups. So depending on where you are, what facilities you've got, what your community is, there may be some opportunities moving forward. Right, I think next slide, Emma. I'm not sure if that, oh yes, questions and answers. Yes, we come to the end. So
there's quite a few questions in the chat. Do you want me to read some of them out to you?
Yeah, shall we go back to screen? Yeah, that's right, yeah, yeah.
So I've got a few questions from Joanne. She says, are we assuming that from the 21st of June, face coverings are not applicable?
I think there's very little said about this. I think we can assume that because they're saying social distancing is completely, you know, that's gone completely. It doesn't actually say anything about face coverings. I think the implication is that that's gone as well, but it's very early days. We can't say for sure. We're just having to wait and see. A good question.
And she's also asked if from the 21st of June are COVID risk assessments and special COVID high requirements still required?
Again, we don't know yet. We've had no indication from ACRE on that. Again, the assumption, which is purely an assumption, is that no, there won't be that requirement. I think they've come up with this 4-step roadmap to recovery, assuming that everything is going to go according to plan. And there was those 4, was it the R number, the rollout of the vaccinations, new strains of the virus. There was 4 criteria, I can't remember. But already there's slight doubts about the vaccination rollout. Already there's the fear of the 3rd wave in Europe coming over here. So, you know, I think there are warning signs that these are not, I wouldn't go by these dates as set in stone at all. And I heard last night, very late last night actually, I was just checking some emails from work, and something that had been mentioned by ACRE to actually flag up with the network, that the government are in debating the regulations tomorrow, the 25th, in Parliament. And the list of things that they were debating was only published the night before, so that would be Monday night. And it was very much change, you know, do expect changes to that roadmap to recovery. So I think already there's there's been the issue about the vaccination rollout and the third wave. I don't quote me on that, but I would just be prepared that we can only go by really what we know for, say, step 1, step 2, hopefully step 3. It may be that step 3 has to be extended a lot longer, and it's too early days perhaps to go into step 4. So there's that caveat. We can only advise you in sessions like this, we can only tell you on the information that we have to date, and that is subject to change. All we can say is, as soon as we know of any changing in the regulations, we have to wait for ACRE to interpret it. We can't get it out there straight away. It may be announced on the telly, but there's always a bit of a lag for the government guidance to be updated. ACRE then have to interpret it, and going back to one of those very earlier slides, it's not just one government guidance. There may be, guidance coming from the ministries, the sports and performing arts, business. There's lots of guidance, and they have to extrapolate the bits that are relevant to village halls. So it does take time. They'd rather get it right, the information right, and have a bit of a delay than send something out in haste and realise that they've interpreted it wrong. So I'm sure you do understand that, it's not slow deliberately, it's slow for a reason. So again, just bear with us on that.
There's also a question from Jill, who says, as it stands at the moment, from the 21st of June, can we accept bookings for indoor parties for up to 100 people with no restrictions at all?
The information that we have at the moment, if that's within your normal capacity, if you can have 100 people in your hall, what they're saying is that all the COVID social distancing restrictions will be lifted. So then we're assuming that you can go back to normal. So have the normal, up to the normal capacity of your hall. And dancing, singing should be allowed. So we're assuming at this stage that means you can go back to normal.
I think Jennifer's got a question.
Yes, after the 21st, do we still ask them to do the cleaning?
I think go back to the system that you had before. It's up to individual organisations how they. Sometimes halls always expected their hirers to clean up after themselves.
Yes, but I meant that everything they touch, it's not just going to go away on the 21st, is it?
No, I mean, I think it's going to be prudent to keep these good practice measures that have been introduced during COVID. I think it's going to be a good practice to carry them on. But I think we'll wait to hear what ACRE say on that, because they will have a guide on the national picture. And I can only talk about Derbyshire, and I'm not authorised to tell anybody what to do. We can only advise. So I'd rather, rather than say, yes, do this or do that, best to wait for what guidance comes out nationally. And then, and also that's handy, because if you're ever challenged at a hall about any of your conditions or reasons for doing things, you can say, actually, this is advised at national level that all halls do this. So it's sometimes good to wait for the ACRE guidance, and then you can feel confident as trustees and managers.
Yeah.
It's you're not just you that are asking for this measure. It's a standard measure that halls across the country would be doing.
Thank you.
So if anybody's interested in we mentioned earlier the national survey, the ACRE survey that came out, their report came out last year, 2020, and they do this every 10 years. I've been around long enough to know being involved in the last one. And it's on our website, it's available on our website, and it's a report that actually shows all the statistical evidence. And if you want to compare your hall with what's happening nationally on a whole range of issues, it's really good to go and have a look at that, because it's a way you can measure maybe your you know, your management of your property against what the national norm is. The only thing with the survey, it's a 10-year survey, it didn't capture the whole impact of the COVID and the lockdowns, because the survey finished, I think, in about March or April last year, when COVID was just starting. So we missed a huge part of history of what's happened to village halls over the last year. So they're doing a follow-up survey. So if any of you participated in the first survey, you should have been asked to complete a few more questions, which is just COVID, the impacts of COVID on the hall. But if you did take part in the first survey and haven't yet done it, there's still time to do it. And ACRE would really, really appreciate to get that feedback. Sheffield University are going to analyse the data, and I think the results from this follow-up survey is going to be absolutely fascinating, because it will really show the true impacts of how it's affected village and community halls. So you'd really be playing your part, actually, if you did take part in that. And if anybody's got any questions, then do get in touch. Is Joanne, are you asking a question? No, not Joanne. Is it Sarah? Sarah Wheatley. You got your hand up, or is it? No, sorry. It was my cursor on your picture. Sorry. I've got my cursor, which is a little hand that's on your face. So I thought your hand was up there. I do apologise. Any more questions then?
That looks to be all the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot to digest, and there is a lot to digest. I found it quite hard to sort of summarise in 2 hours all of the information. It's very, very difficult to highlight just the relevant parts. But I think it's a case of, you know, just we'll suck it and see, basically. I wouldn't take it that this is the be all and end all. ACRE will provide as much information as things do, if things change in the coming months.
Pete Edwards has just got a question. He's just raised his hand.
Okay, Pete. Yeah.
Well, first of all, say thank you, which I'll put in the chat, but I think it would be really useful to have another session like this in July, maybe August, depending on how things develop. But you know, it's a key issue for us if we're operating the hall. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I mean, it's the session, this is the end of 8 sessions that we've been running by Zoom, and it's all been funded through luckily sort of a COVID recovery fund through Foundation Derbyshire, because normally our training we would have to charge. So we've been really fortunate to get this funding, which has allowed us to do these sessions. And then that, we're not sure, but they may be allowed to, we'll be running some further online sessions moving forward, because it's still not out of the woods yet, are we? So, no. But we'll send you the slides, a link to the recording, and maybe if Appendix D, if that's been issued, we'll send you a copy of that. If not, we'll send it as soon as possible. And that's probably it. And if anybody does want to contact us afterwards about any of those issues, or the grants especially, as they're time limited, coming up to the end of March, for this year's grants, do let us know. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And good luck with the reopening.
Thank you.
But all the information and the appendices do go on the website, and you can download those there. Any problems, get back to us and we can send you them.